And welcome. So I do have the chat box open. I'm going to leave that. We're going to sort of look through that a little bit more towards the end of our conversation that we are having with Lisa Weinert, who I'd like to introduce to everybody. First of all, I need to say that Lisa is a dear friend, a sister, and we have got to know each other. I guess it's almost been a decade almost.
Yeah, I
Through
think we have a big anniversary coming up.
Yes, yes, through yoga and through the practice. And I am so delighted and excited to share Lisa's book with you, sort of a summary of her work to date, we'll call it, Narrative Healing. And this is an amazing book, which we'll talk a lot about, and I'll tell you about in a moment. But I just want to give you a little bit of background that Lisa is obviously an author, a yogi, a speaker, a presenter, a teacher. She leads a variety of different programming, both online, in her community, a supportive, nurturing community of writers and seekers. She also leads in-person events, teaches all over the globe, from corporations to retreat holistic learning centers to universities, to one-on-one coaching. She has worked with dozens of award-winning authors over many years as a writing coach, as an editor, as a publicist. And Narrative Medicine, which I just held up, which is a beautiful, beautiful book, is, well, first of all, it is a book that is different than most writing programs. I wouldn't even call it a writing program, even though the heart of the practice is through self-inquiry and reflection that we can use as a writing prompt. But as opposed to, say, a writing program that begins with actually writing in the page, narrative healing begins with the body. And it uses Dharma talks and stories, many wise contributors, both who have been doing the work, voices of people doing the work, as well as experts. And then there's exercises that go with each Dharma talk, whether they're movements or somatics or meditation, relaxation, as well as then sort of all preparing you for reflection, for inquiry. And in this sense, it's not a writing program per se. You don't have to be a writer. You don't have to ever have written to experience narrative healing. And one thing I really love about narrative healing, and Lisa and I sort of have talked about this aspect of touching into our stories over the many years of our friendship, is that in order to really access our deep stories, we have to be in a particular state in our nervous system. We have to feel safe. We have to feel loved. We have to feel that we're in a friendly environment. And that is one of the things that you do so beautifully, is the tone and the invitations. This book itself is like a safe space. And it really allows, I think, for some very deep work. So my intention is to have a conversation about the depth of this work that we're invited into, how you practiced and came into this from your own experience as a healing path, as a spiritual path and a healing path, as a path of self-awareness and oneness, and then how you created the offering and what your wish is. And I pulled out a lot of questions from the book that might prompt us into those conversations. And if you want to veer off course, or you have something important that comes up, you're invited to collaborate at any time. But I thought I would just start with, how are you? How are you today? Like right now, how are you?
I just feel so happy to be here and listening to, for those of you that are listening, I just want to say so loudly and clearly that none of this work would have been possible without your Jillian's teachings and friendship, which are completely intertwined in my experience, and how Jillian's work really gave me the tools and practical experience, and maybe most importantly, um, like a living example of how to live with all of your stories present. And I just hadn't, like, I talk about it in the book, how I hadn't really like seen all of this embodied like off of the yoga mat, like in the world. I didn't really know all of this was possible until I met Jillian and other people like her. So it's such an honor to be here, and I'm so grateful to be so seen and understood and enveloped by you in this community. So I'm really happy to be here.
Mm. Well, thank you for that opening. And is there anything else you want us to know about your journey before I start sort of some pullouts from the book?
I think you really covered it so well. I mean, I think that I really appreciated the way you kind of titrated the word like writer or writing. And I think this work is about writing itself as a tool. But when I'm talking about storytelling and writing, I'm really talking about how we communicate with our bodies, and how writing is often just a very convenient way of putting that into capsules. But we're telling stories all day long with how we breathe and look and walk and talk, and what we read and what we don't read, and all of those things. So I think writing is just it's sort of a convenient container to talk about those different ways of storytelling.
Yeah, okay, so that's really beautiful. And I think the language that we might wind up talking more about is narratives and,
Mm-hmm.
and stories. And really that's uh, well, you say it yourself. I'm gonna begin with something that you've written in the book. You write, our stories live in our bodies, but they don't speak to us in native tongue. They speak in language of the body through tension and emotion. Our bodies are telling us stories all day long, but rarely do we stop and listen to what they have to say,
Yeah.
caught up as we are in the busyness of our lives. So I think that that's a really important sort of entry point to understanding this work is we're beginning with the stories that live in our bodies. So,
Yeah.
maybe for somebody who's not used to listening or understanding that our bodies are telling us stories all day long, like how might you begin talking about this?
Yeah, I love starting this way. Well, I mean, the first thing in terms of that quote or this exercise is to break down a little bit what the phrase native tongue might mean, because it's sort of deliberately open-ended and vague. And when I wrote about it in the book, I'm talking about maybe your native language, which might be English or Spanish or Urdu or French or Hebrew or any number of languages that maybe you just grew up, speaking. And we get so caught up that that's the language. But actually, our body has a different idiom, has a different way of speaking, and speaks to us through like some of the stuff you talked about when we first started breathing together and landing, like where might I feel tension? Am I hot or cold or hungry? Do I have urges or desires or itches or pains or joys or any of those other kinds of instincts that are more related to survival or movement is really the language of the body. So I think learning to speak and understand the language of the body has to do with really respecting that language, I think, first off, which wasn't my experience so much in growing up in New York City and in the Western world, and sort of all the different labels you could apply to that, whether it's capitalism or patriarchy or whatever it was. The languages I grew up with had more to do with achievement and production, being productive, and all of those kinds of things, or like a doing or check off list. And the language of the body, I think a lot of us or I can speak for myself growing up in the Western world, it took me really a long time to absorb in a real way that the mind and body are connected. Even if I sort of understood it theoretically, I didn't live that way. There was still a hierarchy. I still thought the language of the mind was maybe more important, more prestigious or literary or any of those kinds of things. And the language of the body was something to sort of tolerate or to take me places. Like my body will take me to the yoga class, my body will take me to work, or take me do things for me and tolerate when it was sort of not behaving the way I wanted it to. So I think the first step for me and in the book is a lot about like acknowledging and learning the language of the body and respecting that this is a really important, maybe the most important language to connect with first. So I think, I don't know if this really answers your question, but I think the first step when I'm working with people, even yoga teachers, or mind body people, is to acknowledge that they have a body, and that can be kind of like a really tough thing, whether I'm teaching in like a conference room setting or in a yoga studio setting. There's a way when we start thinking about storytelling and narratives that we get into this like different kind of shape, and to acknowledge like what's going on in my lower back, or does my foot have a story right now, or just my needs. Like, we talk a lot about with caregivers, especially like, do I need a drink of water? Or do I need to eat something? Do I need to go to the bathroom? Like all the needs that we kind of subjugate in order to be in the greater story. So the first step is, oh, I have a body and my body has something to say and is saying something.
So that's a really beautiful thing to break down. So especially because there might be a lot of people who are yoga teachers here, perhaps listening to us, or people who have been in the body. And this word interoception or interception, neuroception, like the way we get messages from our body, like hunger or thirst, or what do my organs need? What does my body telling me? Like, so we start to learn that our body is sending us messages about what its needs are, and how we feel. And then there is something that we think about, that you talk a lot about, which is more like the narratives that are in the body. And, let's talk nervous system, right? So our nervous system is always storytelling, always storytelling. So it's not just what our body needs, but we, well, first of all, let's just frame this in something we've talked a lot about, is that science shows we're wired to look for danger. We're wired to listen for danger. It's an evolutionary design, this negativity bias. And so if our nervous system is already designed to perceive and look for danger, and then we see something dangerous, sort of loops, right? We look for something, we're constantly looking. So we're looking for dangerous stories, right? Like, or we're listening for dangerous stories.
Yeah.
In some way. So, sometimes I talk about this as the nervous system has, we'll say, rose-colored glasses. When we're relaxed,
That's
and
good.
at ease, we might be able to see more stories. We might be able to see more of what's good. We might be able to contact more of the people. When we are in the stress response, we're in the opposite. So you wrote in your book, stories are information, emotions, and plots that stem from our nervous system.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm gonna just rewind again and just also say, if there's any noise interference, give me a heads up and we'll figure this out. But I love the way you're pulling things together. I want to rewind a little bit from what you just said. And so it's the first step is awareness. Oh, I have a body, which you just would be surprised how big of a deal that is. People just there's so much emotion that comes up when people are invited to remember they have a body. And then with that emotion, there's a lot of language attached, because emotion has a lot of language. So when we say, there are a lot of systems and people that talk about different parts of our areas of our body being associated with different types of stories. Like, I've had teachers that talk about the lower part of your body being sort of ancestral, and the hips are more emotional, and then the heart is like area of compassion. And these can be very helpful labels, but in the way that I'm looking at it, it's more about sparks and inspiration, and allowing awareness of the body to be an interrupter in the kind of one-way narrative that you're going on in your mind. So I don't really, it doesn't matter so much if a story in the hip is related to emotions or your ancestor. It's more about, oh, like I have a hip. What else is going on right here, right now? It's a vehicle to come into the present moment. And I more think of it as a mindfulness practice in that way. But to go back to what you were saying, what I write about a lot and what I think about very often when I'm working with people, with writers and teaching, is I liken the nervous system to like a very aggressive editor. And like an editor that you might be working with in a publishing house, or maybe you've hired, that has like a genre that they want you, like if you are right, every story has some kind of core message that isn't really that complicated. What makes the story full of life and readable and engaging and makes you follow it has to do with the craft, the description, the voice, the tenor, the volume, the speed, and the genre. So you could tell a story of like Lisa walking to the river or something like that. And if it's sort of a love story, it sounds a certain way. And if it's a crime fiction story, it sounds a whole different kind of way. But there's still, it's the same kind of story. And so I just want to pause a little what you were talking about, being primed to have loving stories or primed to be afraid. And that when you are caught up in fight or flight, or when your body is activated and you feel fear, it's in your better interest to see what's dangerous around you because you're trying to find safety. And you don't really have a wide horizon. So I think of that as the nervous system story, in terms of the nervous system having like modules of stories, as you said a moment ago, or something like that. The stories are going to be scary stories because we're an editor seeking out scary stories. So the editor that's seeking out, stories of connection has to be coming from, they live in different places, and there's, embodiment, other kinds of language we can use to talk about it. But in terms of the storytelling element and connecting with our narratives and other people's narratives, is understanding that the state of our nervous system is a really important, editor, and has a whole different, creates a whole different environment and scene depending on what's going on.
Yeah, so it's so fascinating. A lot of, obviously, we talk about all the time, like the nervous system is at the heart of my work. Mm. And your process through narrative healing is to, from my experience of the book and knowing you, is to bring us in through exercises to downregulate the nervous system.
Yeah.
Shift from a state of stress into a state of relaxation, not to look at the stories from a rosy point of view, but to create enough calm and friendliness that the scary stories have space to be heard and to be held, and space to tell their story about whatever the story might be. And I'm going to bring us into something you share in the book that you write about. Really, first of all, your whole personal story sharing is, you write just exquisitely in your book, and really, like, with a short amount of words, you make some really cutting, deep shares. And so you tell this story, you frame it that storytelling is the backdrop of your whole young life. It's the fabric of your family. You grew up on words and books and storytelling. It was the food you ate, and it was the family events you went to. It wasn't only personal to you, but it was your family culture in a lot of ways. And it was your lifeline until the first interrupter, which was this major health crisis that you had in college, and your relationship with writing and with the word and with story changes, and your writing begins to, affirm your trauma story. It begins to affirm your narrative that you're broken. So you write. This is you right after you sort of, I don't want to blow the whole book, but the story, but right after your college is interrupted.
Yeah.
When I try to write, my words separate me and soothe me. I create grooves, writing in circles about painful feelings and experiences that lead me further inward and isolated from the world. I write over and over, what is wrong with me? I think I have done something wrong, and my pen is not strong enough to pull me out by itself. I focus so intensely on hiding my shame, I no longer know my story. I can't express myself authentically in the moment, so I give up my voice and hand the pen over to a hyper vigilant, unreliable narrator. I give up my voice and I hand the pen over to a hyper vigilant, unreliable narrator. And I think so many of us have this experience. And what I think they might say is, there's a point where the conversation in their head, or the boss in their head, or the narrator in their head is just shaming them more. And we know therapy of all sorts is so important. This is not just about picking up a pen or going to a yoga class. And when we have trauma, working with professional therapy is so essential and important. But what might you add about your own experience, about where you create a shift from, how did you get back your pen? How do you find out who the reliable narrator is?
Yeah.
At that point.
Oh, I'm so glad you pulled that out. I really appreciate that. And I think that's really so the heart of what I'm trying to say. And I really appreciate you highlighting that. There's a couple things to quickly answer your question. My body.
Don't quickly answer my question.
But so I don't forget to say this, my body brought me back 100%. My body brought me back. And what's really important to me about this, this sort of a little bit of background for folks that are joining us. This is describing a period of time where I was experiencing like really severe clinical depression. And it was a kind of pervasive experience. There had been some events, but it wasn't, we talk about, and I do want to just underscore that although I have a lot of experience and knowledge about trauma, I am not a trauma therapist. I highly recommend working with a professional in companion with this book if you're working through trauma. And for me, what I discovered in my story, and what a lot of this section is really about, is that, when we experience a trauma, whether it's an acute trauma or an ongoing systemic trauma, or different ways you want to look at it, I look at traumatic experience as an event that totally overwhelms the system and makes it impossible to regulate and connect with your story. And what can happen in your narrative over time is that story gets it's like in permanent marker in your life, and it goes on loop. So you might be in sort of this repeated story that you were referring to earlier. You might be Lisa walking to the river and like nothing's going on around me, but I get sort of something might happen that will remind me, and my body will think this thing is still occurring, is one way of describing this. And writing can be a way out of that. So that's one of the reasons this book can be impactful, or one of the inspirations for putting it together. But in terms of this experience and what this book is about, is that while for me in my life, there was for sure, harm done or experienced and suffering experienced due to different events or series of events or conditions like this depression, the real suffering I felt I had was from how I spoke to myself while it was happening and later. And so in that moment, when I was, and I talk about this a lot in the book, and I offer clear suggestions and guidelines for writing about traumatic experience. And what I really came to understand, and I refer to it in the book as writing around the wound, is that it's rarely helpful to, while you're undergoing an acute experience, to write right in it repeatedly. And that was my experience for years, as I would write again and again, like the things that were bothering me. And my journal became a litany of complaints and morbid, isolating thoughts, which I thought was writing, and also like terrible poetry and failed short stories and things like that. But it did help to a certain degree. However, the writing's usually really limited because you're writing in an activated place. And you also, the writing itself, it almost acts like you could say like an addiction possibly, but it acts as a way of further separating you and going deeper into feelings of isolation, loneliness, separateness, and misunderstanding and that kind of thing. And so in that passage, I'm talking about this repetitive narrative. And the only way out that I saw at the time was to like climb deeper in and just sort of like let my nervous system, a hypervigilant version of my nervous system, like hijack the equation. So what happened to me is that that just didn't work very well for a long period of time. And I really needed to find another solution. I think if it had worked for me to have like an outward facing hypervigilant spokesperson for me for my entire life, I probably would have, done that. But I think, they talk about pain as the touchstone of all healing and that kind of growth. And for me, it just like really didn't work anymore. And I needed to find a new way out. And for me, that came through yoga and meditation and other kinds of embodiment practices, but it could really come from many other different sources.
And I think that when you say, you needed another way out, I think actually I might say you needed another way in,
Yeah,
right? And
that's good.
I say that because that is really what you offer in narrative medicine, is that you create this safe space to go into those stories where you might have had a yoga practice and a mindfulness practice and a nervous system soothing practice at the time, the repetitive, unreliable narrator you would have seen and heard and even, maybe acknowledged, like, oh,
Yeah,
like, and you too are welcome here. And you would have had a relationship with, instead of being dominated by and or led by. And that's really, what you offer in the book, is that the wholeness of the practice is really what makes it a healing practice. So that you make space. And there's so much I want to ask you about, and we don't have really a whole lot of time. But since, where should I hone in really on just our last few minutes? Everything is such a big question. I guess maybe, maybe I'll talk about connection
yeah,
and community. One thing you emphasize in narrative healing, right? It's not about writing. It's not about completing a piece of writing or having an accomplishment of any sort of writing. It's more, here is a process, here is a practice, and you write, the process is cyclical and ongoing. There's no endpoint. Every day I begin again. Like all spiritual practices, like all practices of healing, it's a choice we make every day.
yeah,
And then, I heard, and I can't believe it. I only heard this like this month. It's not the destination or the journey. It's in the company we keep.
mm,
And I
yeah,
don't know why I never heard that before, but that's a huge piece of narrative healing. It's company,
yeah,
it's connection. And in fact, you have one of your 6 tenets as to connect.
yeah.
So I wanted you to maybe finish up with talking about the importance of community in practice, and where maybe self-healing and collective healing come together in your experience.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, they're completely in conversation with each other. I would describe the book as the first half of the book essentially being like a deep dive inward and connecting to the stories within and having learning tools to connect safely with them and express them. And then the second part of the book is really about releasing your stories in the world. Our stories are meant to be shared. They're not designed to be contained within us privately, all of them, all of the time. Our stories, as an extension of our nervous system, are designed to bring us towards others. And one of the, reliable benefits of this kind of practice, in addition to a lot of the medical benefits like lower blood pressure, lower anxiety, lower depression, and things of that nature are also increased feelings of joy, a sense of belonging, and forging deep and meaningful connections with others. Because the more you are able to, know yourself and befriend the stories within and understand, one of the things that the book is also a lot about is like, who needs to talk right now? Some of the times that like loud voice from before that we've been writing about for too long has just gotten super bossy and loud and has like so much to say. But once you like are like, okay, like here's your megaphone, go yell in the closet or in my journal or whatever, you discover all these other stories that often have really nuanced, incredibly beautiful, compassionate, and very important stories to tell as well. And you see that and those around you. So, you talk about creating space, and it's so much about creating space. And some of them are mindfulness practices and writing practice. But another way you create space for your story is by letting someone else's story in. So that's how we continue to help each other and heal each other, and like a deep understanding that the story that I need to share that might be my most shameful, humiliating story or not is probably, maybe definitely the story that someone else really needs to hear and will be life-saving medicine for them. So I think starting, the end result of the book and this project is a deep belief that the stories that we hold in our bodies have benevolent purpose. And they're designed not only to heal ourselves, but also each other in the communities around us, whether that's your dog or partner or neighbor or larger communities that are important to you. We all have different paths in how we connect and how we share.
And you've worked with specific collective and community healing most recently, I know, with the Everytown gun safety, right? You brought this work into that environment, or
Yeah.
can you finish with sharing a little bit about what you're doing there or what you've experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I was really a huge honor to work with Everytown. There's this heroes of mine, and the work is very similar every place I bring it. I customize and curate depending on who I'm meeting with. Everytown in particular has a rich history of using storytelling, both in their advocacy, like what they're doing on social media, as well as internally. And they rely on a journaling practice for the people on the front lines. So they really, I was sort of speaking with people that were very interested. What happened with Everytown Gun Safety, I did a 2-part narrative healing workshop with them, and my workshop landed a day after the shooting in Maine, actually. So it was and it could have been any other time. They're often dealing with major occurrences. But what really stood out to me with Everytown truly was the social worker who was present, who I want to name. Her name is Abby Hurst, and she created such a safe, thoughtful space. And it was a practice of embodiment and working through writing as a pathway of self-care. And I think just to loop back to this conversation we were having around writing about difficult things is, one of the main tenets of narrative healing is that writing is a healing practice, and you don't have to write about painful topics or traumatic stories in order to receive the benefits. And maybe especially when you're in the sort of sea of a lot happening, it's an even better idea to stick with sort of mindfulness-based creative prompts or other kinds of stories unrelated to what was happening. So for Everytown, for example, we worked with mindfulness prompts relating to environment and connection with self, and we did not talk about anything happening at a larger community level, because the purpose of the workshop was to create grounding and safety within.
So when you say environment, like what would a prompt like that be?
Oh, a prompt like that. Do you want me to give a prompt like that?
Yeah. Just like, if you're saying like you were working with the environment, like what is that?
Yeah, so one of my favorite prompts, I'll give you kind of the two that I did as like one of my favorite prompts to do is, once you're kind of settled, and I think we're all pretty settled here, is to identify a light source in the room, whether it's the window or the glow of the computer or a candle or whatever it is. And for 5 to 20 minutes, describe the light and describe how it's falling, if it reminds you of anything else, what else it makes you think of. And it often like opens a portal to some really interesting stuff, and also recognizing that the way the light is falling right at this moment will never happen again. So focusing on light around you is one way of really coming into the present moment. And another prompt I gave that was really interesting with this group, which is in the book, is about sort of celebrating the magic within every object, and that everything around you has a story, both your body, but also the objects and plants around you. And I guided them in a meditation to discover an object that interested them in the room and write a first person account from that object's perspective of where it came from. Sort of like, so like if I was doing my mug, it would be I, the mug, and where I came from and why I'm here.
And so is the intention behind that to expand our connectedness to the world around us? Like, what would be the inherent intention there?
Well, my inherent intention is that writing as a practice is inherently healing, especially when done in an embodied way. And it really doesn't matter what you're writing about. There's tremendous amount of research that shows that a consistent writing practice over time is hugely beneficial to your emotional, mental, and physical well-being. And so my intention is to give them some kind of creative spark to have an experience. But the result of those two prompts might be the light prompt. People often have an interesting association. Like it will remind them of something and it makes them realize there's a feeling of not being alone. And at least that can come up. And the object prompt, I think it can make you more connected to the outside world, but it's also for me, as for my seat, this acknowledgement that inspiration is everywhere, that you don't need to go anywhere. It's right here. Like, and there's also all this meaning around you right now that you might be ignoring.
So there's so many different sort of levels one could enter this practice from. It could be just discovering that they have a body and what it's like to create a relationship with not living in their head, but that there is something below, and what is it, and what does it feel like, and what does it have to inform me of? And then there is, what is my body holding on to? What has it experienced that it has buried or held or contained or lived with? And then there is also just writing as an actual mindfulness exercise that somebody might go to a yoga class and lay down a mat and move through a series of poses for their body. And we know through research, moving and breathing and being in your body through this series of poses for this amount of time has these biological markers. Well, so does writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of
not
people,
all writing.
I don't think a lot of people know that, that it's like, like taking out a pen and a piece of paper is another way of rolling out a mat and getting out your props.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how you do the poses. It doesn't matter what the words are. It's the process of thinking, writing, like that whole body exercise that actually produces a physiological, biological marker of change and shift and well-being, depending on the intention.
Yeah, and my point is that connecting with your body before gives you a greater chance of receiving all of those benefits. And as you move through the book and you move towards the benefits of sharing your story with another and being of service and community, one of the other sides of that is that goes really two ways. And that comes back to your work so much in terms of being a listening presence. And there's a huge chapter about Jillian. And on both sides of that, one of the things I've been working on with some groups is this knowledge that, embodied communication or body language is in many cases way more powerful than anything we write. Like we get 60 or 80% of our knowledge about someone by how they're holding themselves. So people, like as you walk into the room or go to your holiday or go into a store, everybody in the room knows exactly what's going on with you, whether you tell them or not. So this is a way of, on purpose, telling your story. So I
Yeah,
think that's another part of it.
I love that. I love that you remind everybody about the listening, but also, and I think we'll just end on that point for our conversation, and I'll talk about also, what else is in the book,
Yeah.
but everybody always knows what's going on with us, not only what they see and what they hear, but our chemistry and our energy tell a
Yeah.
story. And so it's another reason why our practice, whatever practice, helps us to take care of ourselves, to be responsible for our own nervous systems and our own healing, because we are continually always emulating and filling up the space around us with our story through our
Yeah.
chemistry, through our energy, through our words, through our language. And whatever ripples out has an effect on everybody we come into contact with. So
Yeah.
one way of creating a more nourishing presence, to creating peace on the planet, is starting with ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, something you say a lot, I've heard you say a lot is, that when you are relaxed, it benefits everybody. And one of the ways I translate that into this work is as you are releasing the stories that are filling you up, you have so much more space to receive. And you become, right, like a listening presence to everyone around you, whether they tell you their story or they just know that they can. And that is incredible service to the world. If you can be part of making one person feel heard, that's life-saving medicine.
Yeah, yeah. And in that relaxed state, if you can also then, you have more ability not to add more aggression,
Oh,
even,
yeah.
even if it's, either you're letting someone feel seen and heard, and or just not escalating and adding aggression where it might not serve the overall evolution of us all. So I just want to thank, first of all, this book is so much more than this very short conversation. And there's so many other topics that I wish I got into, but you are offering another workshop actually in my teacher training.
Yes.
So if you're listening and you're intrigued, first of all, get the book. And there's an audio version of the book that Lisa reads and spent a beautiful time creating. And then she will join us, that you could either join us for the whole teacher training, but you could also just join us just for Lisa's program itself and register for that individually. And do you want to share anything else that you have coming up, or any way that people can connect with you and learn more about your work?
Yeah, everything's on my website. That we're going to provide you guys with more information, but you can go to lisaweinert.com or narrativehealing.com. I think and I'm providing a free week of membership if you're interested in practicing with us. But what I want to add, or as a takeaway, is I really view this work as a companion to whatever you're already doing. And it really does have so many of the same impacts creatively, and also like in terms of on the community as a regular yoga practice. It's very portable. I'm really passionate about how accessible and portable this practice is, that wherever you are, it's really not that hard to start writing. You might not always have the perfect conditions for like the most ideal practice, but think of this as another thing to add to your bag of tricks. And one last thing I want to say, because it comes up almost every single time I teach, is people often ask if it's really important to write by hand. And accessibility is really a top priority for me. And it's just not always that convenient or possible to write by hand. So I want to say that any kind of writing technology works, whether you're doing like audio or writing by hand or texting or computer or whatever it is. But I really hope that you guys will try just writing more. And I want to make myself available as a resource if I can be a support in any way.
Beautiful. Lisa, thank you so much for spending time with us, with me. Thank you for putting out your work in the world. That alone was you being an amazing listener to the work inside you. And we'll just sort of peek over at chat and see if anybody has any questions or anything to finish up on. Hello, Monica, Karen. Yeah, not all can write by hand. Thank you, Pat.
Yeah,
Well,
I've
you're
discovered
welcome.
writing by hand is really doesn't, a lot of people hate it. Like some people love it, but some people really hate it. Um,
I like to do all the things and all the things on the same topic. Like I like to audio record, I like to type, and I like to write the one thing over and over again. Like
say
if I
that
have,
again.
if I have one topic, I use all the ways
Yeah.
to process.
Yeah, I think, I keep saying one more thing. The book has so many different prompts, but what it really comes down to is the benefits really come from like any other spiritual practice that I know about being consistent over a period of time. And if you find one prompt that works for you, stay with that. The benefits are not about doing as many prompts as you possibly can. It's more about being consistent. And I try to give a lot of different options because different things land with different people. Um, I work with poetry all the time when I teach and when I write. I am a huge fan of poetry. Thanks for asking that, Debbie. When I teach, I alternate between prompts that come from an embodied experience, prompts that come from like memory kind of, and prompts that come from outside sources like poetry or excerpts and sometimes music.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And Lisa, we will talk soon. And I love you.
I love you too. Thank you for this opportunity
All
and
right.
thank you for supporting this journey.
And Deanna, thank you so much for hosting us and everybody for joining in.